This is Velvet speaking. Today I will be walking you through research into mental health, self-care and games that was undertaken together with my colleague Immo. This might be a bit of an unusual setup, but thank you very much for coming to our talk. Games and self-care, how games support us to make sense of ourselves. Sadly, we couldn't show up in person because Corona had different plans for us. So today I will just be a disembodied voice coming through to you from the conference speakers. Apologies for this funky setup, but hopefully you can still enjoy our talk. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of this research, I will give you a small overview of Immo and myself. I'm Dr. Spors. I'm currently a researcher at the gamification group in sunny warm Tampere in Finland, where I spend most of my days thinking about care and games. Currently, I'm investigating how games can support us to care for nature, the environment and ourselves. And this is Immo. Immo Kaufman is currently doing their PhD at the University of Nottingham, where they research how games are important parts of people's identity and how games influence people's understanding of the world. Before we get into the interesting bits, I have to add a teeny tiny bit of housekeeping. This talk does not represent our employers, funders or industry partners. This talk is also not comprehensive, and it only shows a small bit of work that people do in the area of self-care, mental health and games. Let's begin by sketching out a bit of context. What's going on with mental health? According to the mental health charity Mind UK, 1 in 6 people in England report experiencing a mental health problem, such as anxiety or depression in any given week. However, there is not enough care for people available, and most countries' healthcare systems struggle to cope with the number of people who would like to have access to it. This overload leads to not enough funding being available, in turn results in long waiting lists for seeing a mental health professional in the first place. Talking about mental health is also still a taboo and frowned upon by many. Generally speaking, people have really unpleasant ideas about mental health. And since talking about them is quite depressing in themselves, we thought we would show them as part of a fake best-of compilation CD. This compilation CD could include You Are Just Lazy by Baby Boomer, Push Through It, Man Up by Concerned Friend, My Hysterical Crybaby by Casual Disregard, Yoga is All You Need by Green Tea Neighbor, and No Depression in My Generation by Iron Granny. In conclusion, everything is on fire. One activity to support your mental health is self-care, which is looking after yourself and doing things that you enjoy and that make you feel at peace. Examples for self-care activities are spending time outdoors, being creative, or playing games. Self-care does not fix the underlying problem of limited funding or lack of care, but it can support people to get through their days. Let's zoom in a little bit on how people do self-care through games. So Immo and I set out to research this area a little bit more, and we started out with 2 questions. First, how do people who have experiences with mental distress use regular games for self-care? And second, what can we learn from games being used in such a way for game design? To answer these questions, we planned our research in 2 parts. Firstly, we needed to talk to people who already use games for self-care, to learn from them as experts. Then, we would turn these insights into a toolkit that helps you to design for self-care in a careful way. We decided to test this toolkit through a game jam and to find out if it works and learn more. So let's talk about the first part. Workshops. Immo and I ran a series of workshops with people who enjoy gaming and who also have their own experiences with mental health. We spend a lot of time thinking, talking and discussing how self-care fits into games and how people play them in careful ways. So, what did we find out? Here are a couple quotes by workshop participants. This is a note that somebody left anonymously in one of our workshops. It is about the game Last of Us 2. Quote, a story that makes you think a lot about grief, forgiveness and revenge. Ultimately, it felt like it was about the fallibility of human nature, about how no person is black or white, and their relationships are complicated. This note showed that the workshop participant reflected on their own life through the game, and that it made them consider how they perceive other people and their relationships as a whole. The second quote is from another workshop participant who left a note about Dragon Age. Quote, Dragon Age gives me time and space to worry about someone else's problems instead of just my own all the time. It's great for breaking out of spirals when I'm stuck in them. This note showcases how games can offer escapism and a distraction from real life when it is needed. Another quote is from our workshop participant Alex, who talked about Red Dead Redemption. Quote, "Something happens during Red Dead Redemption that is very bad for him. The story gave me a strong shock because I kind of lived with him. I lived the story through him. I felt bad with him and understood many things about my life." This quote shows how Alex as a participant made sense through Red Dead Redemption by relating to the main protagonist. Something happening in the game made them not only think about the story, but also about their own life. Now we can begin to see how people use games for self-care. Mainly, games become spaces for exploring people's personal potential. Games become spaces for self-care when people use them to figure out who they are right now and who they would like to be in the future. This also means that playing games for self-care touches on many deeply personal aspects, such as exploring your gender or sexuality, thinking about mental health or disability. As a whole, this also means that there is not one way to play games for self-care, but that all games can be reframed for it for different purposes, like escapism, exploration, processing your feelings, or relating to yourself or other people. As a whole, this also means that there is not one way to play games for self-care, but that all games can be reframed for it for different purposes. Now, we have a little bit more of an idea of what's going on with games and self-care. Time to turn these insights into a toolkit that other people can use as well. The toolkit that we came up with includes information, activities for self-reflection, and ideas that people could use to design games with self-care in mind, but also technologies like apps. We named the toolkit Caring Systems, as a free toolkit for designing and making self-care technologies that are inspired by games. The toolkit is made up of a workbook with activities and info, a template sheet to write down your design decisions, and a set of cards to represent potential building blocks of your game or technology. Now, with the toolkit in place, we could think about how to test it. Here, Immo and I turn to our research partner, the National Video Game Museum in Sheffield. As the name might imply, the NVM is a museum and community space that's dedicated to games and play, and making them fun and accessible for everybody. Together with them, we began to brainstorm. How could we test the Caring Systems toolkit while also investigating games and self-care more deeply? What we came up with was the Self-Care Jam. Half research event, half game jam. A game jam is normally a community event that brings people together to make and play games. Most of them have a specific theme and a time limit, so ours was run for a week and focused on self-care. We were incredibly lucky that a lot of people were keen to join the event, so Immo and I spent a week together with 19 other people, working through the toolkit, discussing mental health, and dreaming about which worlds we might want to live in and what games really mean to us. So what did we learn from the Self-Care Jam? I will again share a couple of quotes with you. The following quote is by Fabien, who wrote to us. Quote, "It's important to take into consideration a wide range of perspectives and ideas, to not just jump into an idea two-footed. It pushes the reader to consider their own position and how that might influence what they make and then think about. Unsurprisingly, designing for self-care is in itself a careful activity that requires a lot of self-reflection and awareness of yourself and the wider world around you." In an interview, Kate told us the following, quote, "Because everything is just work, sleep, play, repeat. So I also think that was a really important part of the jam. It was imagining futures and starting to think about how these futures could be achieved." Kate's quote again highlights how self-care through games is tied very strongly to ideas about the future, both on a personal and a much wider level. Finally, in a survey, Courtney explained, "The jam opened my eyes specifically to certain topics regarding the role community plays in mental health/self-care." This quote shows how important community is to understanding self-care, but also for designing and playing games in a careful way. Finally, what can we learn from all of these things? I will now outline a couple of questions and ideas that hopefully serve as inspiration or where to go from here. Our first suggestion is create possibilities for meaning making. Where games allow for players to take a moment and reflect, they also create an opportunity for self-care to come into play. The key for these moments to happen is to provide players with choices that are meaningful to them, and the agency to take these decisions. Framed as a question, we could ask, what future can people imagine for themselves through your game? Our second suggestion is to create opportunities for people to relate to themselves. Self-care in games can also mean that people relate to themselves, other people, and the wider world around them, which includes non-human animals, environments, or systems. These moments of relating do not happen only in calm, relaxing games, but they can happen in all games. Relating happens when games allow people to connect their own experiences to the game and beyond. Different people have different experiences, so how people relate is very personal and varied. Framed as a question, we could ask, how can people bring themselves into your game? Our last suggestion is to allow for different ways of play and being. Here we would like to encourage you to explore alternatives to what is commonly done in games and to freely experiment and reimagine what games can be. This includes stories, characters, genres, and beyond. Here, we also encourage you to extend care towards yourself, your players, and others, as a game designer that works and acts in caring and considered ways. Framed as a question, we might ask, which ways of being are possible through your game? Now, coming to the end of things, I hope this talk was a little bit useful to you, or that it made you think about care in games a little bit differently. Even though we are not here in person, Immo and I would be very happy to answer any comments or questions you may have. You can reach us via email or on Twitter @CaringSystems. Immo and I would have not been able to conduct this research without the help and support of the following institutions. We would also like to thank again everybody who took part in the workshop series and the Self-Care Jam. Without you, none of this work would have been possible. Thank you for listening, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of the talks. Have a fabulous day. Bye!